you are aware, and I have started the recording. We will provide an archive of it if you're interested for future access. Captioning is being provided. You can turn captioning on through your Zoom menu. We appreciate our captioner working with us today. The Zoom menu is the bar that has the mute and stop video feature on it. You could either see it directly as CC or it's under your more ... button. As an attendee, we do ask you to mute your audio during the presentation. You can use chat to ask a question, or if you prefer, you can use raise hand or voice if you prefer to use your voice to ask a question. We will have an open Q&A period for active engagement, specifically hoping that you will engage directly with Patrick on some ADA 30th anniversary topics. If you do like to use hashtags and tweets and other social posts, we ask you to use hashtag ADA30 and hashtag thanks to the ADA. Those are national tools that folks are using. And if you have any questions regarding the today's session, you can feel free to follow up with Disability in Ohio. That's Chris or TyKiah, or with myself directly, and we'll give you our email addresses at the end. And with that, it's now my pleasure to introduce Christine Moranda, the lead and Executive Director of Disability in Ohio.
Okay, thank you so much, Derek, and thanks for setting all this up today. Hi, everybody. I got that introduction, Chris Moranda, and we really appreciate you joining us this morning for our presentation as we kick off the month of ADA celebrations around the country. So as the Executive Director of Disability in Ohio, it is with great appreciation to our employer members, our board members, and our future members of our affiliate, and also for Ohio Developmental Disabilities Council support of this webinar. Our programs serve as ways to connect you to the nuts and bolts of disability inclusion, as well as today's presentation on ADA30 and where it started, what is now, and what it can be. So as you listen today, check in with yourself to see what is your next and your futures and your company's future vision of disability inclusion. Are you in? I would like to now turn it over to TyKiah Wright, who's the Managing Director of WrightChoice Consulting and supporting our ODDC Employer Engagement Grant. Thank you for being with us today, and really I'm looking forward to this session. TyKiah?
All right, well, good morning, everyone. I am TyKiah Wright, and I am the Managing Director of WrightChoice Consulting Group, and I am supporting this grant. So we look forward to a productive conversation this morning. We're excited to have Derek Shields and Patrick Cokley here with us this morning to lead the conversation. So I welcome you all, and we encourage you to sit back and engage and enjoy the conversation this morning. I'll turn it over to Derek Shields.
Hey, thanks so much, Chris and TyKiah. And we have you two on the left here. That's myself, Derek Shields. I'm with ForwardWorks Consulting, and I'm glad to work with Disability in Ohio and be with all of you today to kick off July and the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's also our pleasure to be joined by Patrick Cokley of Anthem, and I'll be interviewing Patrick, and really want to turn today's webinar into a discussion about the past, the present, and the future. So to do that, what we wanted to do before we have our conversation with Patrick is to really dial the clock back. And what we're gonna do through the power of Zoom and technology is go back to the South Lawn on July 26, 1990, and spend about 2.5 minutes listening to part of the speech that happened that day, where the most significant civil rights legislation of our time, my generation, was passed. And so this civil rights legislation, let's recall, has 5 titles to it. We mostly focus on Title I, employment, right? But Title III, public accommodations, those are the things that opened up movie theaters and restaurants to be more accessible. Those also impact business. Make sure that people with disabilities can access public spaces inside of your businesses. And importantly, Title IV, telecommunications, ensures an accessible telecom infrastructure in the United States. Public services, state and local government, and miscellaneous. Karen Goss from the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center would say that's the stuff that tells you how to sue people. But these are the 5 titles of the civil rights law that we have in effect. And as I said, now I'm going to flip over and let's start today off by going back to the South Lawn. And here we have President George Herbert Walker Bush. And I'm going to bring this up. And if things work right, we will hear President Bush. TyKiah, if you can just confirm when I hit play with the nod of your head that you can hear this, that would be helpful.
The cost that may be incurred. This act does something important for American business, though, and remember this. You've called for new sources of workers. Well, many of our fellow citizens with disabilities are unemployed. They want to work, and they can work, and this is a tremendous pool of people. And remember, this is a tremendous pool of people who will bring to jobs diversity, loyalty, proven low turnover rate, and only one request, the chance to prove themselves. And when you add together federal, state, local, and private funds, it costs almost $200 billion annually to support Americans with disabilities, in effect, to keep them dependent. Well, when given the opportunity to be independent, they will move proudly into the economic mainstream of American life, and that's what this legislation is all about. Our problems are large, but our unified heart is larger. Our challenges are great, but our will is greater. And in our America, the most generous, optimistic nation on the face of the earth, we must not and will not rest until every man and woman with a dream has the means to achieve it. And today, America welcomes into the mainstream of life all of our fellow citizens with disabilities. We embrace you for your abilities and for your disabilities, for our similarities, and indeed for our differences, for your past courage and your future dreams. And last year, we celebrated a victory of international freedom. Even the strongest person couldn't scale the Berlin Wall to gain the elusive promise of independence that lay just beyond. And so together we rejoiced when that barrier fell. And now I sign legislation which takes a sledgehammer to another wall, one which has for too many generations separated Americans with disabilities from the freedom they could glimpse but not grasp. And once again we rejoice as this barrier falls, proclaiming together, we will not accept, we will not excuse, we will not tolerate discrimination in America.
Well, so that's something to go back in time and revisit 1990 and revisit President Bush and the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. His speech ended about 2 minutes later as he was quoted to tear down the shameful wall of exclusion and then sign the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so, you know, what we want to do now, after looking backwards, is now to say, well, what's happened since? And, you know, most of us know this story, but let's just be clear about what's happened since. So if we were to tear down the wall to employment, then since the passage of the ADA in 1990, now I have a slide up that shows employment trends. Percent employed of people without disabilities is this blue dotted line across the top, hovering between, you know, somewhere around 87% and 82%. and that goes through the passage of the ADA and the ADA Amendments Act. And then a line, a red dotted line for people with disabilities that was hovering around 50% before the passage of the ADA, and now is steadily declined towards this 20% mark. So with that in mind, we also look at the employment to population ratio in the United States. Now this slide has a lot going on. It builds off of the previous one, but it starts in 2008. And part of the reason it does that is because that was the last economic downturn. And if we view that percentage of people without disabilities employed at 73.8% compared to 32.7% for people with disabilities. And then we see this downward trend, this U almost. And that was this 10-year process that it took for people with disabilities to return to almost the level of employment they were at as a category back in 2008 at the economic downturn. The people without disabilities got back to work more quickly. And so now we looked at these rates around 75 to 30%, and then a massive drop happened related to the coronavirus pandemic. So the data at the end, 65% and 27% comes from May 1st. That's the last report that was released. We will have new numbers very soon, this Friday. That information will be available, and we appreciate the Kessler Foundation and the University of New Hampshire's Institute on Disability for keeping track of this data and reporting it. But what does this mean? What is the trend? Well, these gaps show that there's a 40% employment gap in the United States. And if the ADA was passed to tear down the shameful walls, well, that hasn't happened when it comes to employment and perhaps other areas as well. And we can look at this in another data sense too, that 27 or 28% people with disabilities are employed. Unemployment has gone up because of the pandemic, but there's 65% employed for people without disabilities, and that's that 40% employment gap. So with this in mind, we had great civil rights legislation put in place, really the envy of the world in many ways. And then our track record for actual employment opportunities has dropped ever since. So let's examine that. And in disability employment trends, I'm going to talk with Patrick Cokley today from Anthem about some of these areas. Because while the employment opportunities have gone down, there are employers that do offer great employment opportunities, and we are making great advancements in many areas. We have increased accountability with entire diversity, inclusion, and belonging units at organizations. People are using benchmarking and other project management tools to track diversity and progress in disability inclusion. Section 503 put new teeth through focused reviews, and leaders are getting involved. Organizations like Voya, Accenture, and Microsoft vocally bringing connection to community. Talent and supplier sourcing is trending in positive directions with next gen or rising leaders efforts. We see neurodiversity and autism at work employment programs as almost an accommodated hiring process being developed, really meeting ADA generation or pride models for sourcing talent. And we see disability-owned business enterprises as an employment option in the US for the first time in our history. Reasonable accommodations. JAN, the Job Accommodation Network, has been really trending since 1983. We have centralized accommodations programs as a best practice. We have applicant and reasonable accommodation tracking systems. COVID-19 demonstrated how reasonable accommodation systems could be utilized and implemented quickly. Inclusive technologies are advancing. When I started in the field in 1995, voice recognition cost around $15,000 a unit. Now it's literally embedded in all of our platforms, and we use voice for more online searches than any other form of searches in the United States. We have the capability of an accessible internet and documents and social media. We have more inclusive remote work. Artificial intelligence is opening up opportunities, and autonomous vehicles may in fact lead us towards transportation solutions to break other barriers. And last but not least, employee engagement is actually allowing employees with disabilities to drive business solutions at organizations with authentic representation, mental health and wellness programs, and return to work solutions. These are positive trends, and today we're really excited to have Patrick Cokley with us from Anthem. Patrick is the Disability Policy Engagement Manager at Anthem. In his role, he supports Anthem's continued engagement and communication with stakeholders on issues related to disability and provides guidance on how changes in legislation and policy may affect care for individuals with disabilities. Prior to joining Anthem, Patrick worked at the Office of Disability Employment Policy at the U.S. Department of Labor. He was the director of the Workforce Recruitment Program and conducted policy analysis. Patrick's expertise also includes emergency preparedness, as well as the relationship between diversity issues and disability in the workplace. As a graduate of the historically Black Howard University, Patrick believes that it is imperative that the disability and traditional diversity communities learn to work together as they both share the core values of inclusion. We are pleased to have Patrick with us today to launch our ADA30 conversation. And I'm going to bring up our first question and ask, well, first, Patrick, how are you doing today?
Hey, Derek, I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks to TyKiah and to Disability in Ohio for hosting this conversation. I'm so happy to be here with all of you.
Awesome. So as we get going with the conversation, I will bring up a spotlight on Patrick. If you choose, you can pin Patrick's video. You can keep it open in the gallery mode. That's really open to you. But Patrick, let's start out with our first question. When considering the 30th anniversary and what we just kind of looked at with the video of President Bush, what advancements do you think have had the most impact on employment of people with disabilities? We had these trend lines down, but then we had a lot of positive trends there that I just mentioned. From your perspective,
indeed.
Go ahead and give us some impressions there.
Well, I think it's been very exciting to see the sort of changes that have taken place. In the 90s, I think one of the most main impacts was that it was thought by many that people with disabilities weren't visible. We had a change from a society where people were not in school as regularly with people with disabilities. They didn't have the same expectations for disability. Now, 30 years later, we have multiple generations of people who've grown up either managing their disabilities and staying in mainstream society, or going to school next to people with disabilities. And so now they also expect to see them at work and to be a part of those societies. I think the advancement in that has been the level setting, the idea that that people with disabilities aren't folks in institutions or folks away or people we've heard of, that we expect to see them next to us at work in society. And now employers are not just saying, am I ready for people with disabilities? They're saying, well, okay, how do we make sure that we're engaging with them? How do we make sure that, there is a pipeline of talent coming in? And it's really sort of made a new, what my wife often calls a new floor, instead of the ADA being the ceiling.
Nice. Thanks for opening up with that. It's, I think, a fine image to keep us in mind, that knowing that even though we might not have the employment rates where we are, we have a new expectation, and that we should build upon that as we move forward. So I will invite TyKiah at any point. If you'd like to jump in, feel free. And I also want to encourage anyone who wants to use chat as we go through today's session to bring up any questions or topics, and we'll be glad to respond to those and bring them up for Patrick that way as well. We do have a couple more people joining us, so welcome to those that have come in a little bit later. All right, so let's move to our second question now. This is interesting based on one of your responsibilities I'm aware of at Anthem. But so, with your role at Anthem as Disability Policy Engagement Manager, tell us, what is Anthem doing to celebrate the 30th anniversary, and then a little bit about your tactics and how you approach that in your role.
Oh, sure, sure. You know, at Anthem, we're actually doing a fair amount in celebration of the anniversary. But the cool thing about it is a lot of the things we're doing are baked in to the already sort of inclusion and diversity practices that we have. And these are things that I think a lot of folks, even if you're at a large organization that's, you know, across 22 states like Anthem is, or if you're even at a small organization that you could say, okay, these are things that we could do. One of the first things that we're doing is we have a internship program called the Lex Frieden program. And the Lex Frieden internship is aimed at recruiting and engaging young people with disabilities to come participate with us at Anthem. We worked closely with our talent management office and our university relations folks in order to make sure that, you know, we were recruiting a good source of talent and making connections with talented students with disabilities. It was really something that we've tried to bake into everything. And the idea wasn't to create a standalone disability internship, but to really make sure that all of our internships, whether they were with the CBC or focused on Asian Pacific Islanders or Latino populations, that they were also looking for qualified students with disabilities to participate in those programs. We've also continued to work with our internal associate resource groups to make sure that, and our associate resource group tied around disabilities called ABLE. And we work with them very closely to make sure first that we are doing good recognition. So we have screensavers and posters and things that'll go out. But more than anything, that we're also fostering conversations about disability across the entire enterprise. So it's not that, you know, you have to throw a huge, large scale event, or it's not that you have to pay for, you know, a huge amount of things. A lot of it is often just making sure that you give everyone the opportunity to participate and to do some recognition. And then as my role, I also have the opportunity, very much like we do with our National Disability Engagement Month recognitions, of working individually with some of our smaller plans. So if they say, hey, we want to do something more for the ADA anniversary or for National Disability Employment Awareness.
Hey, this is Derek. I just had Patrick.
With you. Maybe you want to work with your local VR agency or your local, you know, One Stop or your local Center for Independent Living. So we really work with them on that so that you can meet sort of where you are. Your recognition doesn't have to, like I said, be all big fireworks. It could be very intimate, which is also still very important, especially to your employees with disabilities.
Awesome. Thanks, Patrick. So just to let you know, we lost you for about 5 seconds there, but we got the majority of that point. So I don't think we need to go back and repeat. Like the flexibility and size. I did want to ask a follow-up there. You know, one of the things that we know is important is leadership commitment. And, you know, whether it's from Anthem or other perspectives, do you look at the 30th anniversary as a great time for leadership commitment to, you know, come out publicly and double down on their, like on the employment policies and approaches? Like, does that happen at Anthem, or are you aware of other leaders that will come out during the 30th anniversary and showcase what's next?
You know, I think it is. I think that a lot of folks in the community are using the 30th anniversary as a time to really take stock of where we've been. I think when the ADA turned 21, you know, we talked about what that meant. 30 is almost another mark to adulthood. So what we're seeing this year especially is a lot of new engagement, thought about the next 30 years. People are releasing new materials and books. I actually just got this is a copy of Alice Wong's book on disability visibility, which is coming out, you know, on the 30th year of the ADA. So I think, yeah, I think we're seeing what you might even think of as a next ADA generation, and they're going to use this time to say, all right, we did it for 30 years. This is not new. This is not new thought. So let's now approach this as a standard and see where we can go from there.
Nice, awesome, and thanks for bringing up Alice's book, Disability Visibility. It just came out, and these are authentic stories and voices, and I think there's even an online book club that's some of the storytellers from the book, so check that out, everyone, if you're interested. Cool. So with that in mind, let's go to the third question. I think you kind of you set this up a little bit by talking about, perhaps leadership commitment, but also getting kind of next 30 years or the next ADA approach. And this is connecting, I think, to real intersections and community dialogue. We're all experiencing these national and global discussions regarding intersections with the ADA. And I think we can split them or you can blend them depending on your approach here. But do you have any stories regarding kind of these intersections with the disability community and COVID-19? And then, this other discussion that's going on about racial injustice and police brutality in the country and the intersections between, or perhaps in the world. Do you have any, thoughts on intersections there with racial justice, disability justice, and employment? So let's dig into this a little bit. I really encourage anyone on board here to submit a question in chat too, so we can spend some time in this area. Patrick, your thoughts?
Derek, this is actually, I think something that's very important, especially right now, considering what we've seen with the racial protests and, and with the discussions about George Floyd, as well as the pandemic. Anthem has, along with the Anthem Foundation, has donated about $50 million recently to support inclusive communities as well as communities of color, to talk about inclusion-related practices as well as health disparities. Now, this is actually part of current work that we've been doing as we've looked at the social drivers of health. And I think that what's really been going on lately is that, a lot of these instances like the protests and like the pandemic have really shone a greater spotlight on the connections between access to care, between racial disparities, and the disengagement that a lot of citizens have felt. I think that, in a lot of ways, we've highlighted the best and in some cases the worst pieces. We've seen some really great moments, where we see people doing everything they can to help keep healthy and keep safe during a pandemic. At the same time, we've also seen a significant number of communities, especially communities of color, say that we should have access to things that are standard and are having difficulties get there. I think in many ways, one of the exciting pieces was concepts about the social drivers of health, concepts about communities of color and mental health have, whereas before those were hard to get to the forefront, have now all become common discussions on the news and the media. I mean, we can talk about mental health openly in many communities of color, whereas before we couldn't even bring it up at all. And so you have a lot of things like that happening. And those are leading into insights in the employment realm as well. Now we have employers, again, also where, mental health is one of the disabilities that's still very much stigmatized in the workplace. We're having more open conversations. People are starting to admit and even make greater use of the practices that create positive mental health outcomes for everyone. And those are not seen as just like a thing for certain people, but are really starting to be applied more broadly.
Nice. Thanks for that. I think you wove the intersections pretty eloquently there. I just posted a question in chat, and I'd love to get some other stories from our participants, whether it's a community-based story or an employer-based story. Feel free to chime in. You don't need to be shy. The chat is there to share thoughts and examples so we can learn from each other. COVID-19 in itself has given us an opportunity as a country to experience inaccessibility immediately in terms of a workforce sent home and sent home with platforms such as the very one we're on that don't have embedded access tools. So we all had to stop and think, how do we implement accessibility quickly? And with that in mind, I wanted to find out some thoughts about access from home, work from home, reasonable accommodations, challenges, anything in particular that you experienced at Anthem or you've heard from other employers that you could call out?
You know, I think the work from home challenges is probably the piece that's most apropos right now. I don't know if you guys can tell, like, you know, I have my wife working on another webinar literally in the next room. I have one of my kids with a iPhone coming down the steps right now. I mean, this in many ways is the new normal. What I think is interesting about this is that many of these concepts tied to telework, especially in the use of technologies, you know, again, if you talk to us at the end of 2019 and said, hey, everyone needs to do this, we had employers who balked. We had employers who were unsure if they had the capacity to pull off that use of technological advancement. However, now, post-pandemic, we've seen a level of flexibility that the disability community had been advocating for a long time. And it's not perfect, but it's sort of shown us that, you know, these things are possible. And I think it goes very much to the intent of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It wasn't saying, you know, that let's go ahead and restrip the entire workplace process, but let's use accommodations that are reasonable and tools that can be a benefit for everyone. And again, we have another example of the disability community, technology specifically, suddenly finding benefit for the entire community. It's sort of an interesting concept around universal design. It's like ramps, you know, that are made for people with mobility disabilities, but work for people with strollers. Or like texting, which is, you know, developed to support the deaf community, but something we all can't live without. So it is an interesting time. And I think it's a time where the iron is hot for us as the disability community to really press for more of these things to become permanent.
Nice. Thanks for those examples, Patrick, because I think they resonate with us. And Leslie shared in chat here, I think that COVID-19 has given everyone this opportunity to view our circumstances from other worldviews that until now we may have taken for granted, leveling the playing field in a way. And I think that's so true. I mean, I know of organizations that were limiting work from home or telework as a form of reasonable accommodation because they thought it was bad for business outcomes. And then literally within a week, everyone in the company was working from home. And so what we saw there was really discrimination. And, you know, now the playing field is leveled, as Leslie says in the chat, because of a must. It was a requirement. And all of a sudden, the way that some worked is the way that all work, like texting. So
and you know what, Derek, one of the things that's interesting to me about that too is, you know, since we originally also started this question about racial justice as well, I think that there was also a subtext in the disability community and in some of the racial spaces that having access to those things, having access to accommodations, or having the ability to be out about your disability was not something that was equally available to everyone. There was a belief that if, you know, you needed an accommodation, you needed to have a super significant disability, where we know people with disabilities don't really think like that. Your disability is just part of your identity. And then in some cases, I think it was thought that, you know, well, these things are only for aging populations, or only for, you know, that's something that if you're a person of color, that's something that white people do. What's also interesting about this period right now is that in these broader conversations, we've now also started talking more about multiple and dual and, you know, intersectional approaches, meaning multiple identities, how disability and race cross over, how disability, race, poverty, you know, all of those things. And in thinking about that, we've now had to sort of change our approaches. We've had to take away the value judgments that say, oh, well, that accommodation might not be for you or for me, and instead say, what does everyone need to bring their whole selves to work and to do their best job? And that's that interesting space that we get in, especially in the disability community, where you have different types of oppression crossing over, you have different sorts of inclusion. And really we have sort of, we become part of this greater mission to make everyone feel included and a part of, the greater workplace environment, but also realize that there are separate paths that we need to make sure are clear for everyone in order to get to that inclusive place. And disability and access is just one of the paths that ties in with everything else.
And Patrick, I'll jump in and say, as we talk about inclusion and, being mindful of our current employee base, when we think about the racial injustice, for us as people with disabilities, I think we also grapple with the notion of how do we make our voices heard?
Yeah.
In this movement, how do we, show our support? Because we do have the existence of COVID-19, and we can't get out there because of the pandemic. So we struggle with how do we make our voices heard in this pandemic? So I think as employers, it's also important to think internally, what can an organization do internally to ensure that all the voices are raised and heard and that they feel valued even in today's time?
Yes. Very much agree.
Outstanding. Thanks, TyKiah. Well, I think you could have an entire, as we talked about in planning this, we could just talk about question 3 for an hour or two. But I think you framed it well, and it's something that all of us can explore at our own areas of employment or even in our own family rooms. And these are discussions that will be going on for a while. But yet this era allows us to readdress and hopefully recreate and double down on disability employment, where as before, we wouldn't have had these learnings. I'm going to move to our next question now, just being focused a little bit on our time. So Patrick, as as an employer, what gaps are out there and what remains to be done? And this is a pretty wide range, but if we can reflect back on some of those trends in employment, we talked about, looking at accountability, talent sourcing, retention and advancement, technologies, and employee engagement. You want to bring up a couple of themes from your work at Anthem on this area?
Oh, of course. It was a very interesting experience being able to come over from working in the federal government, where I was working specifically on employer-related policies, as well as running the workforce recruitment program, which identified qualified students with disabilities at colleges and universities for opportunities in federal employment. And then coming over into a corporate space and realizing that a lot of the lessons or the ideas that we had in the public space that we leaned on are still in some cases being learned or implemented effectively in the corporate space. And one of those gaps was that, there is a desire to include individuals with disabilities, but not necessarily an understanding of the best ways to do that will be most effective for every organization. And one of the gaps that we identified and started addressing at Anthem was first, even just in general ideas of recruitment. There are a fair amount of recruitment services out there that will say they'll connect you to individuals with disabilities. But what we determined was that rather than reinvent the wheel, let's try to find the best ways to get connected to disability candidates in places we're already looking. So this becomes something that's important for any employer. If you have a relationship with local colleges and universities, make sure your relationship with your career services offices also includes your relationship with disability services offices. And this is something that we did, as I mentioned, in the Lex Frieden internship, not only identifying qualified candidates to participate in that internship, but then also saying, hey, if you're recruiting at HBCUs, if you're recruiting at historically, at HSIs, historically Spanish institutions, Hispanic serving institutions, or AAPI schools for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, make sure that the message about disability inclusion is also getting out there. We specifically created a coalition between our disability policy engagement team, our talent management office, which includes our university relations, as well as our inclusion and diversity departments, in order to make it so that as we were addressing this recruitment, we were sort of covering all bases. I think another piece that some companies fall prey to is they're looking for one source for disability, forgetting that disability is so pervasive in our society that, you know, you have to sort of make sure that you're pulling in from other spaces. So it's been really exciting doing that work, working with the colleges in that way, and realizing that we can work in coalition. And then the fun thing is you then use those candidates that you identify as ambassadors, you know, for the next steps of the program. So like I said, we work with our internal associate resource group. We make sure, as we make partners, as we've made with Disability In, we make sure that we're constantly having this conversation and make it known that at Anthem, the disability identity and experience is a valued part of our associates.
Oh, that's a great way to summarize it there too. And clearly you are one of those ambassadors. You might be like
I like to be.
you're like a camp counselor ambassador to the other ambassadors, I have a feeling. So let's touch on ABLE. You mentioned that's your associate resource group. Describe that a little bit more for us, you know, as a strategy.
Sure.
How do people get together, like through chapters? And
Sure.
you know, how it connects to the business itself.
It's actually a wonderful approach, and I think you know, understanding and making use of a good associate. Ours are called associate resource groups. They might be called employee resource groups in other places. The main focus of ABLE is, again, to sort of twofold: to create a safe space for associates with disabilities to either talk disability identity, get access to resources, or feel a connection to their role as people with disabilities and as Anthem associates. But ABLE also has an interesting relationship with our inclusion and diversity division too, in which it becomes a way for important information, knowledge, cultural discussion about the disability experience as associates to make its way up to our IND division. And that sort of information sharing and connection means then that all of those things that we learn as associates with disabilities, as people with disabilities, either serving our members or even in our own sort of roles, that then inches up into our inclusion and diversity offices and becomes a part of Anthem's plan. So it really speaks to the idea that, you know, it's important that you not just have a group like this for people with disabilities to come together. That's important. And it's not just for them to come together and complain about things or address changes that are needed. That is also important too. But it's also important that the information, the knowledge that they develop and share then makes it to a place where it can be incorporated into your company's planning. When you start doing things like that, then you're changing from just recognizing that disability exists to actually engaging with a disability community, creating an identity, and then really making use of that knowledge in the same way we would for any groups that participate with us. The other interesting piece about the disability ARG or ABLE has been also our connection and engagement with the other associate resource groups that we also have. Anthem has a robust amount that include representation of, you know, Latinos, African Americans, veterans, Asian Pacific Islanders, women, work at home associates, and our Pride, which is our LGBTQ resource group as well. And one of the things that we've discovered in working with them is, since disability crosses over in all those spaces, then if we do our outreach properly, all those groups also become allies for disability and inclusion. So you end up with this sort of dynamic where you're not working for one little bit of freedom. You're not sort of trying to, you know, eke out this little piece of pie. When we need more inclusion, we just bake more pie together. And it's been really exciting to see that sort of start to happen.
Nice. Thank you for that. That's awesome description of ABLE, but let's say that one more time. When we need more inclusion, we just bake more pie together.
That's right.
Right on. Really appreciate and embrace that. How about a thought on advancement? You know, we've become better in the country about bringing people in at times with underrepresented communities, but we still don't see leadership representation at rates that perhaps we should, especially after 30 years of the Americans with Disabilities Act. What are you doing around leadership development of employees with disabilities?
You know, That's a good question too, Derek. And I'm glad you brought up advancement, because I think initially, sort of in this first 30 years of the ADA too, we've seen a lot of focuses on recruitment, getting people with disabilities into jobs, even if they're entry level or early level. But yeah, the steps or the identification for success is almost always tied to, are you moving into leadership? For our Lex Frieden program, we specifically have set it up so with the idea that the internship should just be a start into participating in Anthem. And in fact, we've even moved. I want to say we've only had the internship going on for a short time. We already have at least 4 or 5 interns that have been taken into permanent positions. So they started as interns and are now full-time, full-fledged associates in different sort of realms of responsibility. And the internship itself is not tied to entry-level work, it's tied to engagement. So I think that's the first thing. Moving from talent sourcing into retention, you need to have a plan. And the plan needs to not just be we're having an internship for internship's sake, but we're actively attempting to change or develop our pipeline. And then from there, you go into the things that I think we have all learned that are successful. You need to think about mentoring. You need to think about how access to tools and resources plays out for all associates. And you need to think about, are there any inherent barriers that have sort of culturally arisen in our organizations that we should address, in order to create broader inclusion. If executive training, events take place at inaccessible places, well, then we need to change how those events take place. If there are requirements, for advancement that include, using internal testing platforms that are inaccessible, well, then those things needs to change. And those changes will always be for the benefit of a broader organization. One of the things we've also learned is we've recently revamped our accommodations team, which provides accommodations to all employees. And as we've been doing that, we've been learning that there are ways to make sure that all associates, even if they're new to disability, have access to these tools and resources. And that has improved, not only their identities at Anthem, but their ability to do their best work.
Awesome. Well, I could continue in this question forever, I think, but we want to do our speed round, and then we want to get to some questions, hopefully from our audience as well. So we have 3 questions to go. As you know, I'm going to turn to them, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the community. So how about a personal story that maybe you can share with everyone around the connection to the ADA or to the Amendments Act? Either one. Any personal connection there?
Sure. There is one story that I think is worthwhile sharing. Recently, Cheryl Sensenbrenner, who's the wife of Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner, passed away a couple weeks ago. And what I think is important that we share with each other is about her role in the passage of the ADA Amendments Act. As the wife of a congressman, she had a lot of access to the members whose job it would have been to bring that legislation to the floor. And, early on, they were having difficulty, rallying the votes that were necessary. And, I think a lot of disability advocates have had their time storming the Capitol, sitting in front of offices, and members pay attention. But it's a different scene when it is another member's wife who you've known and who you have met and who you've talked to. And she very much used her privilege as a leverage point for the disability community. She opened doors that would not have been open to us. She caused conversations that would have been brushed off to become more intimate. Right now I always think we're thinking very much about her, but also thinking about how the ADAAA would not have been passed without her. And in fact, if you look at the picture of George W. Bush signing the ADA Amendments Act, it's full of, a lot of our great, leaders from the congressional space. And, Cheryl is also there in red. And so it's a reminder that we can use all of our personal talents in our engagements to make a significant change in the world. And I think a lot of us in the employer space, that's an important thing to remember. You say, well, this is just my tiny office, or this is just my tiny branch. Is it really that important? yes, it will be important to someone, and that importance may spread in a way that you hitherto was unexpected.
Thank you, Patrick. Very wonderful to honor Cheryl Sensenbrenner with your memory there about a personal connection to the Amendments Act and connect it to how we can all make our impact in our little corners too. Next up, this one, thanks to the ADA, fill in the blank.
Oh man, this is fun. Thanks to the ADA. I mean, I think I could say, thanks to the ADA, we are developing communities in which disability is no longer a dirty word. Or thanks to the ADA, I can live in a city where I can expect to be able to get around with transportation options and access restaurants, even though I don't have a car. But I think in many ways what we should say is, thanks to the ADA, we have created a new standard of expectations for people with disabilities, and not just Americans with disabilities, but all Americans who will have disabilities, so that we know our futures will be brighter and more accessible from this point on.
Awesome. Wow. I think we got 3 thanks there, but that last one really knocked it out. Appreciate that. All right, now let's look forward. And this is our final question, then we'll open it up. Where do you think we'll be in 10 years? Let's look down to July 2030 and forecast a little.
I mean, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Because I think, the ADA signed in 1990, okay? And 10 years after that, our entire concept of sort of the world changes. We go from a place where the internet is something that you get in the mail on your CD to pretty much, YouTube isn't developed quite yet, but it's almost there. The internet just booms. So, 10 years is such an amazing amount of time. I would hope that in 10 years, we have begun to firmly address the technological element that was sort of included in the original ADA, but we've never really gotten our hands around. We have the ADA includes a section on telecommunications, but the internet as we know it developed after the fact. So I would hope that in the next 10 years, we'll really start to address the importance of baked in accessibility. And I think, Derek, you even made mention of the fact that, like concepts like voice recognition, were these expensive, clunky pieces, but are now equally incorporated in. I think all of us who are using Android phones and iPhones are starting to get used to this accessibility being baked into the operation systems. And I think I'd like to see it be even more so, a world where digital accessibility is a thought on the front end, not tacked on, for further accessibility for folks. I'm hoping we'll get there. And then that'll extend even further into things like the gig economy, like, the use of apps, all that stuff that we're working with right now.
Awesome. That's a world I think we'd all like to be in, and perhaps in 10 years' time we could have that and autonomous vehicles that are safe and getting people to work and all those other things. All right, well, let's open it up now. I'm going to stop the share and ask 2 things. One, if we have a question, you can use chat, but I'd also like those that are willing to turn on your cameras and join us on screen. We'd like to get a capture of you all joining with Patrick today and us. So we invite you to turn on your camera, and if you have a question, please raise your hand, use your voice, or submit it in chat. We have some cameras turning on. Thank you very much.
It's cool. Hello, everyone.
Hey, there's real folks out there. So anyone have a question for Patrick about or an impression about ADA at 30? We're getting some more. What do you think about Patrick's work at Anthem and his comments today? I'm going to push someone to make a comment here. We appreciate you joining us. We'd love to have a reaction to some of the comments that he's made.
Take one quick.
Hey, Derek, while we're waiting for people to comment, there's a quote that I love, that says diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to
Yes.
dance, right? And then belonging is when they play my song. So when we say thanks to the ADA, I oftentimes say thank you to the ADA, because it's allowed me to be invited to the party and it's allowed me to be asked to dance. And I feel a sense of belonging.
Nice. Thank you, TyKiah, for sharing that with us. I think it's a succinct way of pulling all of this broad, complicated discussion together. And I know that when I've heard it and shared it with others, it helps them connect some dots too. That's
Absolutely.
wonderful. Hey, we have a couple comments here. Patrick, somebody says out there, this has been a fabulous presentation. Our organization has a long way to go. I think we'd all agree that we all have a long way to go. I think the work that Anthem is doing is inspirational and everyone can learn so much. Great presentation.
Oh, indeed. Thank you. Derek, also, as I was sitting here thinking about it, the other piece that I guess would be awesome in 10 years, especially with us having this conversation, is, we're starting to talk about disability inclusion in a space for employers. Hopefully at some point, this also makes it into business school spaces. That was one of the things that we even thought about at ODEP for a little while. How do we teach disability inclusion and not make it something something that'd be nice to know or something you have to respond to? How about we get this into the core knowledge base that if you want to be a good manager, you got to think about how you're going to make your workplace inclusive, and not just for people with disabilities, but for everyone. So not a skill set that's secondary, but a skill set that's primary.
Yeah, well, I love that recommendation. I went to a business school that had a disability employment component to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I graduated in 1999, and that operation suspended in the year 2000. So there are no business schools in the world that do that. We do have Teach Access, and so they're trying to bake in accessibility into computer science teachings. That's
yes.
a good idea. I met yesterday with 2 young adults with intellectual disability, and they're not being taught project management skills because people assume they don't need them.
Right. They won't be managers.
Yeah. So if we could put more of this content into early training as early as possible, then more people would grow up knowing it.
Yeah.
So we're not getting any questions, but feel free. I'm going to pause one more time, but then it's the hour, so I will wrap up. Anyone have a question or a comment they'd like to bring forward to Patrick? People are shy, or they're waiting for the next cup of coffee. Okay,
That's all right.
I'm going to go back to our slides for a little bit. I'll just, we did create a handout for today because we covered a lot of trends, but one of the things I wanted to make, especially the folks in Ohio, aware of, that you can go to www.adaanniversary.org and you could sign an Ohio proclamation indicating that your organization is supporting the ADA and will commit to the tenets of the ADA from an employer's perspective. There's also other states, so if you're coming in from somewhere else, visit adaanniversary.org. At that site, you can get access to ADA training. You can get a media kit with logos, social media posts, and join in on the conversation that will be happening throughout July and share ADA fact sheets. Importantly, July 1st is today at 1 o'clock Eastern time. It's a 30-minute live webinar at adalive.org. Eve Hill, formerly of the Department of Justice, will be interviewing the Honorable Tony Coelho, one of the original sponsors of the ADA, former chair of the President's Committee on Employment of People with Disabilities. That's today. So if you didn't get enough of us, you can tune in and get some of Eve and Tony at 1 o'clock Eastern time, right there at adalive.org, and follow the national story at adaanniversary.org. There's also materials available for you through the U.S. Census and the U.S. Department of Labor. At Pete Works, it's a Twitter handle. They're going to have an hashtag ADA Next 30 conversation going on throughout the month. So if you're on Twitter, check that out. Again, Twitter hashtag ADA30 and hashtag Thanks to the ADA will be used throughout the month as well. There are a lot of events happening. Even though they've gone virtual, they're still happening. Disability Unite will have an event on the anniversary itself, July 26th. Cincinnati has a Disability Pride Parade that's been moved virtual. You can find that content online. and Cleveland has 30 days of celebration going on online as well. I'm also aware that the media in the arts, disability media and the arts, will have a celebration online on July 23rd. So look for that coming out. That's a cool production that will be online on July 23rd with a lot of famous artists and performers with disabilities putting together a show to celebrate 30 years of progress. All of this material is involved with a handout as well, and Chris Moranda and TyKiah Wright will share that with everybody to help you as an employer with disability inclusion. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Chris to talk about an evaluation that we have and how to get your HRCI credits. Chris?
Yes, hi, thank you. How about that for an hour of packed full information and stories and dialogues on the ADA. It's great. It was just absolutely fantastic. So want to share with you how to get your first evaluations. Are so important to us. We need you to share what your thoughts are, what your future thoughts might be, what you might want to see Disability in Ohio provide to you, because that is who we are and what we do. You're going to get an email from me. It was through this Eventbrite thing. So that's beyond my comprehension, but at 10:15 you should get an email, and then what you can do is fill that out quick, easy. You just forward it to me, fill it out, send it let me know if you want that HRCI credit, and we will get that to you. So again, a special thank you to Derek, TyKiah, and Patrick, our panel, and hashtag thanks to the ADA30. So we appreciate you, and thanks for attending. I'm thinking this conversation ought to keep going. So I'm banking on us trying to pull this esteemed panel together in October for the National Disability Employment Awareness Month, because I have a feeling lots will come out of this month and will propel us forward into the fall. So thinking about that, hope that you would enjoy that. And if you are interested in joining Disability in Ohio, reach out to me and I'll be glad to speak with you and get you some information. Thank you so much, and I'll turn it back to Derek. I'd like to do a raise the roof if anybody wants to show your video.
Well,
I don't know if we could do that, but we're raising the roof. Thanks, you guys. Turn it back to you.
I did get a picture of everyone, Chris, so
okay.
It's not a raise the roof, but it is everyone that turned their cameras on, and maybe we can post that.
We appreciate it.
Chris and TyKiah, thanks for being awesome hosts at Disability in Ohio. As affiliate of Disability, and you're bringing disability inclusion to the workplace, supply chain, and marketplace in Ohio. Special thanks to Patrick Cokley for joining us today from Washington, D.C. We appreciate all you're doing at Anthem, and for sharing your resources and your thoughts and ideas. We've had some great feedback. On the screen, we have our emails. You can reach out to all of us. Chris Moranda at di_oh.org.
Oh, dash.
Oh, it's dash. Okay.
It's a dash.
di-oh.org. TyKiah.Wright@gmail.com, Patrick.Cokley@anthem.com, or me at dshields@forwardworks.net. Hey, to close it out, Patrick, in 30 seconds or left, your final thoughts for today.
You know, my final thought is we are so excited. We all can do our part towards inclusion. As we celebrate and remember the ADA, remember that it is not an act that was designed just for people with disabilities. It is an act that's designed for the civil rights of all Americans. And, you know, we can do all our parts in order to promote that inclusion and make sure that we understand that disability identity is all of our identities.
Awesome.
Well
Thank
said.
you so much, Patrick. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Be safe out there, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.